Hello and welcome to this episode of the Push Podcast. My name's Jack Ferguson, an evidence-based brand consultant, and I do this podcast for senior marketers so that you can feel seen, get ideas for stakeholder management and persuasion, and talk strategy. But not only all that, it's also to provoke thought. I want you to go away from these episodes with your subconscious applying what I or my co-hosts speak about in these episodes. I release an episode every week. Sometimes it's a solo episode like today. Sometimes I co-host an episode with another senior marketer. So today I'm bringing you episode 52 and I'm going to talk about Play-Doh. When I think of Play-Doh, my mind goes straight back to kindergarten, actually, and that's where I first played with it or encountered it, I believe, a long, long time ago now. But this brand has made a particularly interesting decision, I'd say, in the last 10 years, and I think there are some lessons we can learn from it. So I want to start this episode by asking you a question. And after I ask the question, I want you to pause the episode briefly and think of your answer. And my question is this: when you think of Play-Doh, what do you think of? And what sense does it trigger for you? All right, I'll give you 5 seconds. I'm going to guess your mind went straight to the feel, to the touch of Play-Doh. I know that's certainly where my mind went, but you may be surprised to know that they actually trademarked their smell. Yes, in 2018, parent company Hasbro, who owns Play-Doh, trademarked the smell of Play-Doh in the US. You might think to yourself, why not trademark the touch and not the smell? You'd think that the dough's texture would be just as distinctive, if not more. But indulge me for a minute and let me have a go at trying to answer this question on behalf of the company. So I wasn't on Hasbro's brand or legal team when this decision was made, but I'll take a stab as to why they may do this. So one consideration is that trademarking a tactile quality like a texture may simply be too difficult. I'm not a lawyer, but to my understanding, you can't trademark a quality that's functional or necessary to the product's use. So I assume this rule's in place to avoid giving companies a monopoly over something that competitors would need, something foundational that they would need to make their own usable product. Play-Doh also released a product in 2020 that had to do with scents. So I think this trademark was probably in preparation for releasing that, and probably why scent itself was also trademarked. But while we're talking about scent, it is actually quite a fascinating concept when it comes to brand, because trademarking scents is notoriously rare. I found evidence that suggests there's about 10 current scent trademarks in the US. Depending on what resource you consult, the approximations range between 8 and 15, but let's just say 10 for argument's sake. If you look at Australia, that approximation drops down to about 2 or 3. So one of those being that the scent of eucalyptus radiata being applied to golf tees. So quite an unusual combination, I would say. I don't actually know why they did that. Maybe they're an R&D company who are doing product development and trying to on-sell that to retailers. I'm not sure why that happens. I think the point here is, though, it's such a rare thing to happen in general. So why may scents be really rare to have trademarks? Well, it may be hard to do for a start. And secondly, it may not be that commercially useful most of the time. So for example, I'd say that Subway has a very signature smell to it when you go into a store, but I'm guessing it's probably too generic to trademark. It may be a function of their product, like just a byproduct of what they do anyway, which then couldn't be trademarked, or they just don't really have a legal reason to do it. So if a competitor is going to try and capitalize on the scent they've created, how would they do that? Like, what would they actually do? How could a competitor reproduce Subway smell and then benefit from themselves? Where would they deploy that smell? And this is where sight and hearing differ, I think, a bit from taste, smell, and touch. So sight and hearing are easier to communicate digitally, and there might be a bit more protection around that in general. But say if you look at taste, smell, and touch, those are all things that need to be experienced. And if you trademark something, all it really does is give you cause to go after someone if they copied you. It doesn't mean that they won't copy you, and it doesn't mean that you can't own a scent, a smell. It doesn't mean you can't own something in the consumer's mind anyway. You don't have to have it trademarked for you to be able to own something in their mind. So now I've laid down the background of the story. How can we learn from this for our own purposes? And that may not be clear. I understand that at this stage of the episode, but I did need to give you the backstory so I can talk about the rest of the episode. Now, The first thing I'd say is that I'm going to argue that distinctiveness isn't always designed. Sometimes it's discovered. So if we're using Play-Doh, for example, it was invented in the 1930s and it was repurposed for kids in the 1950s. So that original formula naturally produced its distinctive smell, I believe. I can't find any evidence where anyone suggests that the scent was actually designed as opposed to the scent being a byproduct of what they were doing anyway. So not necessarily a brand or legal decision. There's no historical record, to my knowledge, of Hasbro saying that they deliberately engineered the fragrance for brand effect. What I could find is that on Play-Doh's 50th anniversary, so in the year 2006, Hasbro released a limited edition perfume that captured the Play-Doh aroma. And at the time, Play-Doh's marketing VP, Lee Ann Capello, said that one of Play-Doh's compound's most notable characteristics is its scent. And smelling that scent transports someone back to childhood. In 2020, Hasbro released a product line called Play-Doh for Grown-Ups, which I imagine is trying to tap into the nostalgia of Play-Doh, and it is the product line that I mentioned at the start of the episode. So they got their trademark in 2018, they released this product in 2020. But again, I'm arguing that this is a case of them recognizing the distinctiveness of something within their brand as opposed to engineering something for distinctiveness. I think it's much more likely that they probably engineered the touch and feel of Play-Doh for distinctiveness. And that still is distinctive. Just because they don't have a trademark on it, it doesn't mean that there's not a certain touch and feel to that would make you think of Play-Doh if you felt it. It is just very curious that they've released an entire product more so focused on the scent in 2020. So it would seem that they're trying to tap into nostalgia and that they think that scent was the way to do that. So that's why they've released a product range that capitalized mainly on that. So the other thing that I would argue then as a follow-on from this is if distinctiveness isn't always designed but is often discovered, you may not know why your brand is distinctive to others, and you might know what parts of your brand are most distinctive to others. If you thought of touch when Play-Doh was mentioned, for example, but in reality you would recognize the smell if you were exposed to it, then this could be a metaphor that we could use for the distinctiveness of our own brand. Perhaps what you imagine your brand to be distinctive for is not going to be what is the most distinctive sensory experience related to your brand. Perhaps it's a good idea to think beyond sight for distinctiveness. So if we factor in the other senses, smell, touch, taste, hearing, perhaps that's something we should look at too to think about what is distinctive about our brands. And there's a critical point here to me is that there may already be equity stored in our brand with a sense or a combination of other senses that we're not even aware of. And if we're not aware of it, we don't know to promote it or to use it. And here, one thing we can ask ourselves is not how do we make our brand distinctive, but we can say, what is our brand already distinctive for that we are unaware of, and explore all five senses, not just one. We can't always predict what will stick in the market, but we can pay attention to what is sticking. We can explore what has stuck. Now, I want to give you another example of an incidental distinctive asset, and that's the AFL's Red Sheeran ball. You may or may not follow the AFL, but the shape of the ball is quite distinctive. Yet it was a material necessity when they created that ball. You need that shape to be able to play the game. If you compare that to both American football and rugby codes, the AFL ball actually has a flatter end and a fuller body. So there is some balls with a similar shape but are different. They still feel different, but they don't use red, any of the other balls. So the decision to make the ball red may have been a conscious choice, but the shape of the ball and the feel of the ball was probably a bit more incidental than that. So I'd imagine that the AFL has built somewhat of a monopoly on that asset because the shape of that ball is only used in AFL. And you'll sometimes even hear commentators say the Red Sheeran. So I'm not sure if that's deliberate or not to encode that asset into the mind of the market, but that seems to come up a bit in commentary if you listen. Speaking about listening, thank you for listening into this podcast today. I hope that gave you some things to think about. And I'll summarize that by saying just because our minds jump to something that we think is distinctive about our brand, it doesn't mean that's what would happen if that doesn't mean that's what's most distinctive about our brand. We may be unaware of what's most distinctive about it. And the other thing is that if we had a different sensory experience that is linked to this brand, it may trigger the brand even though we didn't imagine that's what's going to trigger the brand. So the Play-Doh smell versus feel point is a good metaphor to consider here. While trademarking a smell probably isn't necessary for most of us, exploring other distinctiveness probably is. And the other thing I want to end with today, and perhaps foreshadow into some future episodes, is around how we can think of distinctiveness in the future. So brands may have a wider array of distinctiveness across the sensory experiences than what we realize. Again, Play-Doh is a great example there. We wouldn't probably think of smell as being distinctive for them. But we could also look at a brand like Coke. So we may think of taste there, which would be distinctive for Coke, perhaps sight, the red can, and just the visuals that we're used to from Coke. But they've done a half decent job with touch and sound as well. So I'll talk about that more on a later episode. But not only that, I want to talk about compounding when it comes to distinctiveness, because if we add an extra sense to our brand that is distinctive, that doesn't necessarily add recall linearly. It compounds it, rather. I'm somebody who thinks about compounding rather than adding. And this is a great example of how we can do a better job of that. So when we think about multiple sensory cues associated with our brands, being experienced together, our brains actually link this all together into a single holistic brand. And that's often referred to as a brand gestalt. I think the best distinctiveness play is in transcending senses. And I'll foreshadow now that that's a better way to evoke feeling for our brands rather than simply recognition. So in future episodes, I want to talk about that deeper emotional encoding, like those memories that feel a bit more personal. So you get that visceral familiarity, the kind that feels like you've lived in something rather than it's just been advertised to you. And I also am going to talk about a more robust memory persistence when it comes to distinctiveness in our brand. Often referred to as redundant sensory encoding, but what it means is basically that the memory of our brands lasts longer. If a brand is stored in multiple modalities, so different senses, it greatly increases recall, strength, and persistence. So how do we encode brand memories with more effectiveness, but how do we also do it with a more robust persistence as well? And I'll be speaking about that on further episodes. I hope you enjoyed the episode today. Thank you for listening in. I'll have all the helpful links in the description of this episode so you can go and look into all the things I spoke about if you would like. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll be back in your ears next week with a co-hosted episode with another senior marketer. Thank you.